So hello everyone and welcome to the Statistical Society of Australia September webinar. I'm Adrian Barnett and I'll be your chair today. Firstly, I want to acknowledge that most of us are probably on First Nations land, and I acknowledge the Turrbal and Yagara people as the First Nations owners of the land where QUT now stands. In the spirit of reconciliation, the Statistical Society of Australia acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respects to their elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. And given this webinar is also open to members of the New Zealand Statistical Association, I'd like to extend this respect and welcome to Maori people. I also want to say thanks to Carmen Lim for helping to organise this seminar. And today's seminar is titled An Application of Network Meta-Analysis to Evaluate the Effectiveness of Electronic Cigarettes on Smoking Cessation. And the speaker is Dr. Gary Chan, who is a statistician and epidemiologist at the National Centre for Youth Substance Use Research at UQ. His current research focuses on causal mediation analysis and the epidemiology of substance use among young people. He has served as a consultant at the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime to evaluate the data collection methodology on global substance use data, and as a biostatistician for the Westmorton Health Service and Ipswich Hospital. Gary, welcome.
Thank you very much, Adrian. Yeah, thanks for the introductions. And thank you very much, everyone, for joining me today. And today I will give an overview of network meta-analysis. It will be a non-technical overview, and I will touch on the key idea conceptually. But if you are interested in the technical details, these are the references that you might want to start with. I will use some motivating examples from my work with my team, looking at to evaluate the effectiveness of e-cigarettes for smoking cessation using network meta-analysis. The data and the analysis code is available in my GitHub account. This is a link. You can follow me in Twitter. That's Gary CK Chan is my Twitter account, and also my group research groups account, NCYSUR EPI. I missed an I here. Sorry. All right, so the motivating examples would be on e-cigarette and smoking cessations. There is two key research questions that I want to answer. Can e-cigarette help smokers quit? The second one is e-cigarette more effective than traditional nicotine replacement therapies, such as nicotine patches? So before I go into network meta-analysis, I just give a recap of what meta-analysis does. Meta-analysis is an evidence synthesis method. It usually follows a systematic search of existing literatures on the research questions. For example, is cognitive behavioral therapy effective for alcohol use disorder? Can e-cigarette help smokers quit smoking? So the key idea is that we find a bunch of studies addressing the same research questions, and then we combine the estimates from these studies to form a pool estimate or a weighted average. For meta-analysis, there are two key models that we can use: the fixed effect model and random effects model. For fixed effect model, the key underlying assumption is that there's only one single effect size that underlie all study in the analysis. Therefore, differences between studies are purely due to sampling errors. This is also known as the common effect model. If you look at the right-hand side figure here, suppose that the triangle here represents the overall population average, and I have two studies in my meta-analysis. The circle here would represent the true average, true mean for that study. And the observed mean, which is the square here, deviated from the true mean just purely because of sampling errors. The true mean of all studies are always the same. So that's the underlying assumptions of fixed effect model. For random effect models, it relaxes this assumption a little bit. Studies may share a common effect size, and it is also possible that the effect size varies from study to study. So in other words, there's a distribution of effect size. For example, now, if the population true effect size in the whole population is represented by this triangle here, each individual study here would have its own true mean. And the observed mean would deviate from the true mean because of sampling errors. So in this case, there's two sources of variations. One is the sampling error, and the other is the variations of each from each study. These variations, if there is a substantial variations, also known as the heterogeneity in the study samples or design, say for example, some study might be conducted in United States, some study might be conducted in Canada, some study might use youth samples, some study might use adult samples. In that case, a random effects model might be more appropriate. So, traditional meta-analysis is very useful for comparing two treatments. Say, for example, nicotine replacement therapy versus control conditions in smoking cessation. However, for most medical conditions, there are often more than one treatment. For example, for smoking cessations, we might use NRT, nicotine replacement therapy, or e-cigarette. For alcohol use disorder, there are many different treatments. Say, for example, pharmacological treatment, CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. People might also go to Alcoholics Anonymous. The key idea of network meta-analysis is that we examine the network of interventions. It is an extension of traditional meta-analysis. There might be multiple ways to make indirect comparisons. And the key idea of network meta-analysis is thus to combine direct and indirect comparisons for inference. Let's go back to our example, e-cigarette and smoking cessation. In the last few years, policies for e-cigarette use has been under heated debate in Australia. And Australia is the only Western democracy that bans sales of nicotine solutions for e-cigarette use. Advocates of e-cigarette always claim that it could help millions of people quit smoking, leading to tremendous gains in public health and cost savings from smoking-related diseases. However, opponents of e-cigarette claims that there's no solid evidence that e-cigarette help quit smoking, and it might act as a gateway for young people to start cigarette smoking. And even e-cigarette can help smokers to quit, there are other equally effective products, such as nicotine replacement therapy, so there's no need to legalize e-cigarette. So these are the claims that we can evaluate using a network meta-analysis. There are two key research questions. The first one is e-cigarette effective for smoking cessations compared to control conditions? We can examine these evidence by direct comparisons. For example, we can look at e-cigarette versus control directly. However, we might also evaluate the effectiveness of e-cigarette versus control by indirect comparison. For example, we can firstly look at e-cigarette versus NRT, and then NRT versus control. Therefore, the effect of e-cigarette versus control through indirect comparisons thus equals to the effect of e-cigarette versus NRT plus the effect of NRT versus control. Similarly, the second questions would be, is e-cigarette more effective than nicotine replacement therapy? We can do a direct comparison here, e-cigarette versus NRT. We can also estimate the effect through indirect comparisons. Firstly, we can look at e-cigarette versus control, and then we look at NRT versus control. Then the effect of e-cigarette versus NRT through indirect comparisons is then equals to effect of e-cigarette versus control minus the effect of NRT versus control. Network meta-analysis thus exploits all available direct and indirect evidence. It is therefore more powerful and produce better estimate if several assumptions are satisfied. What are these assumptions? The key assumption is that the studies in meta-analysis are independent. The second one is unique to network meta-analysis. The underlying effects are consistent. This assumption is also known as the transitivity assumption. What does that actually mean? So to put it in simple language, it just means that the direct effect is consistent with indirect effect. For example, the effect of e-cigarette versus control through direct comparisons is consistent or equals to the effect of e-cigarette versus control through indirect comparisons. So let's look at the comparisons between e-cigarette versus control. If we look at indirect comparisons, we will need to look at e-cigarette versus NRT first, and then NRT versus control. Then the NRT studies in e-cigarette versus NRT comparison should be similar to the NRT studies in NRT versus control comparisons. If the NRT studies in the first comparisons were mostly based on participants with mental health problems, and the NRT studies in the second comparisons are mostly based on general populations, the transitivity assumption is likely to hold, because the NRT study in the two separate comparisons are not comparable. However, there are inevitable differences between studies in systematic review. So now the questions become, are these differences large enough to induce intransitivity? So let's look at a few more solid examples. The first one is the one that I just mentioned. If the NRT studies in the first comparisons were mostly based on participants with mental health problems, and the NRT study in the second comparisons were mostly based on the general populations, then the transitivity assumptions is unlikely to hold. However, if the NRT study in the first comparisons were mostly based on female, and the NRT study in the second comparisons were mostly based on male, this assumption, the transitivity assumption, may still be fine if the effect of NRT on smoking cessation is similar for male and female. That is, in other words, gender does not modify the effect of NRT on smoking cessations. So let's look at this in three more solid scenarios. When we assess transitivity, the key question to ask is, are the distributions of effect modifiers across different comparisons similar? In the first scenario, if the gender compositions of the NRT studies in the e-cigarette versus NRT comparisons and in the NRT versus control comparisons are similar, this is fine. If the gender compositions of the NRT studies in the e-cigarette versus NRT comparisons and in the second comparisons are different, but gender is not an effect modifier, that is, no gender differences in the effect of NRT on smoking cessations, then this assumption is also fine. However, in the third case, if the mental health profile of participants of the NRT studies in the e-cigarette versus NRT comparison and in the second comparisons are different, and mental health is a known effect modifier. For example, if NRT might only be effective among participants with no mental health problem, then this assumption is violated. Let's put this into a more solid example. We can conduct a network meta-analysis using the net meta package in R. There are other packages available, such as the GEM-TC package, but I've tried different packages, and it seems to me that the performance and estimate from these packages are very similar. All right. So to perform network meta-analysis, we need 5 key columns of data. The first column would be the study label. You can have, in my scenario, there's the first study is a multi-arm study where in this study, we have 3 arms. We have 3 separate comparisons: control versus e-cigarette, NRT versus e-cigarette, and control versus NRT. It should be noted that if it is a multi-arm study, we will need to use exactly the same study label. And then we would need to have 2 columns specifying the comparisons. Column 2 column, this column for treatment 1, the same column for treatment 2. And then effect sizes. We will need to have a column of effect size. If it is odds ratios, risk ratios, and hazard ratios, these effect sizes need to be log transformed. And the last column would be the standard error of the effect size. these are the code for network meta-analysis. You don't have to take any screenshot. These code are available in my GitHub account. The only things that you would need to look at now is that in here, I specify that I want a random effect models because there are quite a lot of variability in terms of samples, sample size, sample selections, and also study design. This is the output from a network meta-analysis. The only things that I want to draw your attention is this. Now we have an extra column for adjusted standard error for the treatment effect. For two-arm study, the adjusted standard error would be exactly the same as the standard error we provided. However, for multi-arm study, the adjusted standard error is different from the standard error that we provide. The reason for that is because we will need to adjust for dependency in multi-arm study. All right, here comes the key output from this network meta-analysis. So based on both direct and indirect evidence, smokers who use e-cigarette were more likely to stop smoking than smokers in control conditions, based on the estimate from inside the red circle here. The risk ratios is 2.27, and the 95% confidence intervals is 1.55 to 3.32. So the idea is that, like, on average, the risk ratios is 2.27. It can be as small as 1.55 and also as big as 3.32. Similarly, now we can look at the comparisons for NRT versus control. Smokers who use NRT were more likely to stop smoking than smokers in control conditions. And the risk ratios is 1.56. And the effect can be as small as 1.23 and as big as 1.99. Lastly, this is the effect size we estimate when we look at smokers who use e-cigarette versus smokers who use NRT. So now smokers who use e-cigarette were more likely to stop smoking than smokers who use NRT. The effect size is reasonably, I'll say the effect size is moderate, 1.45, and the 95% confidence interval is 1.03 to 2.05. So it means that the effects can be as small as 1.03, which means that the e-cigarette is slightly better than NRT, or the effect size can be as big as 2.05, which represents pretty good effect size. So these are the key, what I just talked about is the key the key conclusions from this meta-analysis. But we will need to evaluate the model fit of this network meta-analysis model. The key things that we need to look at is the heterogeneity and inconsistency. Inconsistency refers to how well the direct evidence aligns with indirect evidence. Heterogeneity refers to the degree of variation within each design. In this network meta-analysis, we have 5 different designs: control versus NRT, e-cigarette versus NRT, control versus e-cigarette, control versus NRT in 3-arm studies, and control versus e-cigarette in 3-arm study. So now if we break down the heterogeneity and inconsistency estimate, we can find that this result just tells us that majority of the heterogeneity and inconsistency arise from within design, which means that there's quite a moderate level of variability within study within each of these designs. However, for between design inconsistency, there's not much inconsistency between design. And we can also look at I-square here. This is I-square. It refers to the overall heterogeneity and inconsistency. It is a metric range from 0 to 100. If we have a value that is close to 100, it means that there's a lot of variation across study, and the comparisons in your network meta-analysis might be questionable. Next, we can use the Netsplit command, Netsplit functions from network meta-analysis, the NetMeta package, to split the direct effect and indirect effect for each of the comparisons. So there are some differences between the direct and indirect effect in the comparisons of control versus nicotine. And there's also some differences for the control versus NRT comparisons, and some differences between the nicotine and e-cigarette versus NRT comparisons. These are the estimates from direct effect and indirect effect. But overall, these effects align with each other. They don't go into opposite directions, and the effect size seems to be pretty consistent as well. You can look at the p-values, but I know that Adrian doesn't like p-values, so I will skip that. Overall, the p-values give you some idea about how strong the evidence is if there's differences. All right, for network meta-analysis, some key ways, an important way to present this result is to use a forest plot. And this forest plot is slightly different from the traditional forest plot from a meta-analysis. In a traditional meta-analysis, the forest plot would show every single study. But for network meta-analysis, it would be more informative to look at each comparisons and look at the evidence look at the estimates from direct and indirect estimate. So this is just a summary of a graphical summary of what we've seen before. For the comparisons between control versus nicotine e-cigarette, the direct estimate is 2.71, the indirect estimate is 2.03, and the network estimate, like weighted by both direct and indirect estimate, is 2.27. So we can interpret these results similarly for the other two comparisons here. We can also visualize the result using a network plot. In my analysis, this network plot is not very informative because I only have 3 different interventions. The thickness of the line joining the different interventions represent the level of evidence. If we have a lot of interventions such as this, the network graph would be much more informative. This is an example when the network graph is very useful. Lastly, we can qualitatively evaluate the heterogeneity or inconsistency from a network meta-analysis using a Netheat plot. This is a pretty complex plot. I'll walk you through slowly. First of all, we will need to focus on the gray square. And the columns and the rows. Pairwise comparisons from 3-arm study, 3-arm design are designated by the underscore here. So the first row represents the control versus e-cigarette design from a 3-arm study. The area of these gray squares are proportional to the contributions from the treatment comparisons in the column to the treatment comparisons in the row. Therefore, square on the diagonals thus represent contributions from direct comparisons for a particular design. What does that mean? Let's look at a more solid example here. In the control versus e-cigarette comparisons, which is the 3rd row, the largest contribution was from the design control versus NRT from the 4th column, followed by the design e-cigarette versus NRT, which is the 5th column. So in the other word, the evidence from the comparisons, control versus nicotine e-cigarette, largely draw from indirect comparisons. the contributions from direct comparisons from two-armed design, which is the third column, and from three-armed design, which is the first column, was relatively small because the gray square in these two columns is smaller than the gray square in the fourth and fifth column. It is still a moderate level of confidence. It is still a moderate level of evidence, but just not as big as those from the other two comparisons. And we can also interpret the color from the Netheat plot. First of all, we can focus on the diagonal. It decomposed the inconsistency to each design. The inconsistency here refers to the between design component of the heterogeneity and inconsistency. Design that contribute to high level of inconsistency were shown in red. But in this case, you don't see any red because from our previous result here, we've already seen that there's not much inconsistency between design. This is an example where there's some inconsistency for some design. You can see that at the top left corner, there's some bright red color here. It means that these two designs contribute to inconsistency in this network meta-analysis. Again, we can look at the color on the off diagonal. This further breaks down the inconsistency from a particular design into the contributing component. But again, in this case, because the whole network is quite consistent, we can tell from the previous few slides that the direct effect and the indirect effect are generally in the same directions. So you don't see any red here. Lastly, we will need to evaluate whether there's publication bias in our analysis. We usually do this through funnel plot. If this funnel plot is not symmetrical, that is that these dots are heavily on one side, then it might indicate that there is some publication bias and some studies are missing from your analysis. This is pretty much all I want to go through for network meta-analysis today. Lastly, we still have a little bit of time, so I would like to show everyone a project that I've been working on. In the last few years, there are conversations on improving reproducibility. And there are also trends of people moving from commercial software to open source alternatives, such as R. And there are more and more emphasis on data visualizations. So therefore, I created this software and I created software stacks notebook, and I spent all my weekend in the last 6 months to develop this. It is a free open source software, and it focuses on 3 core design principles: simplicity, functionality, and reproducibility. It is fully integrated with R, so it provides the full capability of R. It provides intuitive point and click menus for analysis, and it provides a notebook interface to facilitate reproducible research. The key mission is to provide a viable open source alternative to commercial software, such as SPSS and Stata. So I would like to do a quick demonstration using this software Stacks notebook to conduct a network meta-analysis. So this is the interface of the software. I might tune my screen resolution a little bit so that you can see that more clearly. All right, so like this is the interface of the software. And on the right-hand side, it's a notebook interface where you can interact with R directly. Like say, for example, you can type in any R command, and it will send a command to R and then retrieve the output from R. For example, if we type 1 + 2, it give us a 3. 2 + 3, it gives us a 5. We can name each block so let's name that computation 1 and computation 2. So the code are always organized in block, and the result are always displayed below the code that you've written. Like we can minimize the block. Now, say for example, if we want to do a network meta-analysis, let's open up the data file here. For every actions that you've done using the menu on the left-hand side, Stats Notebook would generate the corresponding R code on the right-hand side and put it in a block. You can always rerun these analyses by selecting the block and click the Run button here. For example, for the after you load the data file here, you want to go back to your previous computations. You just select that block and click the Run button. The analysis will be run again. So now, after I use Stats Notebook to load up the data, you can examine the data on the left panel. And you can click on Analysis, Meta-analysis, Network Meta-analysis to select the variable that you want. The study variable would go to study label, like this is a study variable. And when the data is loaded up in Stats Notebook, all the categorical variable will be treated as text first, and you will need to convert that into a categorical variable or a vector variable in R. So you can just click on the orange icon here. You can change the variable type, for example, categorical here. And for treatment 2, I select that as categorical. Again, you can see that it would automatically generate all these code on the right-hand side in different blocks. You can organize these blocks by merging them as well. Like say, for example, now you can label this block as low data and the second block as data management. Now we put treatment 1, treatment 2, and the effect size, which is the log risk ratios, and the standard error of log risk ratios. On the analysis settings, you can select the effect size that you are looking at. In this case, it will be log risk ratios. And like I want forest plot, hit plot, network plot, and funnel plot. You can just select nicotine e-cigarette here as the reference category for the forex plot. And you can now click code and run. You can see that all the code are generated on the right-hand side. So that's why I say that you don't need to take any screenshot if you use Stats Notebook, because all these code can be automatically generated. And there you go. These are the output from the network meta-analysis. Like say, for example, these are the estimates from the random effect model. And if you scroll it down, you can see all these nice forex plot, network graph, hit plot, and funnel plot. So basically, you can complete the network meta-analysis just with a few clicks. One of the key features of the Stats Notebooks here is that you can also regenerate the original settings from the code. Because I understand that a lot of our clinical researchers and practitioners, they might not be very comfortable with working with a lot of different code. So after you generate all these codes from the menu and you do a range of other analysis, like say, for example, if we reset the menu, you can, if you haven't changed the code here, you can always restore the menu using this button. Now the original setting for this code block is restored from on the left-hand side. So that's pretty much our demonstrations of the network meta-analysis using Stats Notebook. And so let's name this block as network meta-analysis. And you can delete block that is no longer useful, like say, for example, computation 1, computation 2 are block that you don't really need. So you hit the delete button. All right, yeah, there you go. So you basically complete a network meta-analysis very quickly using this software. We still have a few more minutes. Let's demonstrate the data visualization capability. I can create a new notebook and let's load up another data set. For example, I have another data set that is on cancer. We have tumor size, we have this is data set on lung cancer. We have tumor size, we have lung capacity, we have age, and so on, a lot of other variables, and smoking status. So we can visualize this by, we can do some very complex plot. For example, we want to look at the bivariate associations of tumor size, lung capacity, age, for example. And then I want to do this analysis by smoking status. You just select all these variables on the right-hand side and click Code and Run. The data visualization functionality of Stacks Notebook is powered by ggplot. And you can see that now you would have a very nice plot here on the right-hand side. That's pretty much all I want to show for today. And let's go back to my slides. So Stacks Notebook will be officially released in October and November this year, but the testing versions will be available on request. After that, I will run a few free workshops on conducting various analysis using R and Stacks Notebook. These analyses will include longitudinal data analysis, causal mediations analysis, moderation interaction analysis, missing data handling, handling distribution assumptions, violations in general linear model, and data visualizations. And if you're keen to contribute to this software, and if you're keen to improve statistical rigor across different disciplines, feel free to join me, and I will need some volunteer to develop the wiki page and also tutorial pages. To get the latest update for Stacks Notebook, please follow me on Twitter. This is my Twitter account, and also you can follow my Facebook page. Thank you very much, everyone. And this is pretty much the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Gary. That was very interesting and very nice to see that. And I really hope it gets used. I look forward to the launch. So I think we've got some questions in the chat just while people are going. So just one thing that occurred to me, I haven't done it. I did network meta-analysis a long time ago. You know, you were talking about differences where there's things like gender. Is it not possible to, you have to put the unadjusted estimates into the network meta-analysis? You can't use adjusted. Let's say we had 10 studies and they're all adjusted for gender. Could you put those estimates in?
Yeah, of course, you can put the adjusted odds ratio or risk ratio in the model.
Okay.
Yep.
So if there's like an area where there's a common problem that everybody knows is a confounder, that can be sort of removed that way.
Yes, you could still be adjusted. If that study adjusted for that particular effect modifier, it would still be fine.
But you kind of need all the studies to do it rather than...
Yeah, it would be very difficult because like different study, they might adjust for different things. And some study, they might, like say, for example, in my example, if some study, like in my example, is that they might just look at e-cigarette use on smoking cessations only on mental health patients. And then this study, you would not be able to adjust for that because the whole population is just purely based on mental health patients.
Yeah. So that's where, some other analysis, and maybe like a leave one sensitivity analysis seems like a sort of logical thing to try for.
Yes, of course, yeah. Yeah, you can try, like say, for example, if you suspect that certain study might contribute to inconsistency, you can get rid of that and rerun the analysis to see whether it gives you a very similar result.
All right, I've got some questions. So this is from Farah. Is there a way of checking transitivity statistically besides looking at the study population characteristics?
Transitivity is, you can compare the direct effect and indirect effect because the transitivity, the whole motivation of transitivity is to ensure that the direct effect and indirect effect is consistent, right? So like say, for example, you can look at, this is the slide, you can quickly look at the forest plots, say for example, it would give you an idea about whether the direct effect and indirect effect are consistent. And you can also look at, say for example, comparing the direct effect and indirect effect and perform a Z test and look at the p-values.
Okay. A question from Rakib: Is this stats notebook comes as standalone software? Is that right?
Yes, it is. It is a standalone software, and it just the reason for that is it package all the necessary R package in this software.
So all you need really is a web page. Is that right? You just need a web browser, and you're going to be able to run this.
You will need to download the installer.
Okay, but so but you don't need to install R. You need to. It's a separate thing. Is that right?
No, you don't need to install R because I've already when you run my installer, the R would be automatically installed.
I see. Okay.
It's free. It's free.
Sorry?
Is it free?
Yes, it is free. It will be released as a free open source software later this year in October and November.
Thanks for that. And then another question that occurred to me, probably as soon as I saw the title, is that, you know, I know we were talking about the technical aspects today, but the particular network meta-analysis you were doing in this e-cigarette area has been massively controversial. And, you know, I've heard of stories of people who are colleagues and now don't talk to one another because one of them thinks that e-cigarettes are evil and the other one thinks that e-cigarettes are wonderful. So have you published this meta-analysis, and have you been drawn into that debate in any way?
Yes, I actually joined into this debate quite often, and I also received email from individuals saying that commenting on my research. So like in this research, I compare the effectiveness of the effectiveness of e-cigarette on smoking cessations, and this has already been submitted as publications, and it is under review. And I also published another study that tried to evaluate the gateway hypothesis of e-cigarette using meta-analysis. That study has just been accepted as a publication, and I can send everyone a link to that publication if you guys are interested in that.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, and there's another question from Michael. Is the control treatment consistent between studies or over time? Similarly with EC treatment, is it the same in all studies? Good question, Michael. Yeah.
In this case, the control treatment the control group are those who, there's quite a lot of variability. So that's why there's some heterogeneity in this model. Like say, for example, we see that there's moderate level of heterogeneity, but it's not very large. So the reason for that is the control treatment conditions. It's not exactly the same. Like some would use placebo e-cigarette. Some control conditions would just be like information flyer. So the control conditions are not exactly the same, but all the control conditions do not involve nicotine.
Right. So they're kind of similar in what they're trying to achieve, but they're doing it in different ways.
Different ways, yeah. But it would all be non-nicotine based control conditions.
Right. And I suppose some of them might have different inclusion. Well, you've mentioned that, yeah, as well, like the different populations and the different inclusion exclusion as well.
Yes, that's correct.
All right. I hope I haven't missed any questions there. If there's any last questions, please post them now. Can we please get the slides? Oh yeah, people are asking for that.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
Yeah, it seems like you're very into open and sharing, so yeah, I'm not surprised by that. Does this software produce league tables? Is that sort of, maybe they're looking at those things that rank, rank the strength of the treatment or something like that?
Yes, there's some, there would be some ranking. You can, I haven't implemented that yet. You can use our functions net rank to produce that table. But that's a very good suggestion. I would think about that and include that in when this software is released.
Thank you, Farah, for that question. What about the measure, e.g. observed versus imputed missing?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
From Ron, what about the measure, e.g. observed versus imputed missing?
I'm not very sure. So,
Ron, do you want to provide some more detail on that question?
Yeah, most smoking cessation trials impute missing to all, impute failure to all missing cases, which reduces the effect size or the absolute effect size, but not necessarily the relative one, as you realise. And depending on the percentage of missing cases, you can get quite a lot of heterogeneity in your control condition simply as a function of the amount of imputation.
Mm-hmm. So like in the study I use here, like some of them use like intention to treat principle, so everyone is included. Some of them, unfortunately, they do a complete data analysis. I would say that like some of the analysis also from another audience. Some of the study are a bit dodgy, and I've done sensitivity analysis to exclude these studies. Like some study only have a very short follow-up using a very small sample size, and I've done quite thorough sensitivity analysis knocking off these study, and the effect size seems to be still there.
Yep.
All right, we've got another question from Christy. Gary, you mentioned that the I-squared gives an estimate of heterogeneity and consistency. Is that correct? I thought it was heterogeneity and compare the direct and indirect for consistency.
Heterogeneity. Is that correct? Yes, like the I-squared here, I should clarify that the I-squared here is a measure of our heterogeneity within design.
Across all the estimates?
Yes, that's correct. Yep.
Okay. So, and you, Michael, thank you. I think we answered your one on dodgy ones there as well.
Yep.
Wonderful.
All right, sounds good.
Well, Gary, that was very good, and that's neatly an hour. Sorry again, everybody, about the late start. That was, as Mark said, a bit beyond our control. But that was a really interesting talk, and thanks everybody for coming.
Yep, thank you very much, Mark.